Being here in Atlanta, we have some great things to be excited about, but we also have some things to be very seriously considering about the world around us. And I think Christianity and the gospel, specifically Easter, and what we're going to be talking about in a few moments, has a lot to say about both joy and about suffering, the suffering of those who are right here in Atlanta under this kind of slavery. The gospel is very relevant to these matters, especially the issue of Jesus' death and resurrection, which we're going to be discussing. So the matter of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, even though we're at this prestigious university, shouldn't be seen as something that's academically removed from us, or some kind of a historical investigation, or perhaps some kind of theological matter that may or may not pertain to us as it's related to reality. No, the gospel message, whether or not Jesus died and rose from the dead and who he claimed to be, has such an impact in our lives that I dare say it's the question that has the greatest implication. What you do with the question, who is Jesus and did he rise from the dead, is perhaps the most important thing you will ever do in your life. Now, in my case, I believed not that Jesus had risen from the dead when I was a child. Far from it. I was raised as a Muslim here in the United States. And the idea that Jesus even died on the cross was contrary to what I had been taught. And in fact, a position that I had argued from childhood was that, of course, Jesus didn't die on the cross. If he didn't die, he couldn't have risen from the dead. So it wasn't just something incidental to my beliefs as a Muslim. I vehemently argued that Jesus didn't die on the cross. And yet I stand here before you specifically because the evidence of Jesus' death and resurrection was that compelling to me. I want to emphasize that again. It was the evidence that got me to move into the direction of accepting whether or not Jesus had died and risen from the dead. Islam to me was a religion I loved. It was a religion I loved following. It was a religion of my family. And for me, it would cost a lot to accept this message of Easter. But the evidence was that compelling, and I hope to present that information to you today. If you're wrestling with these matters, I'm here to assure you that the evidence is quite strong. Now, some people might say, Nabil, the idea of Jesus rising from the dead, how could that possibly be something that we can investigate historically? And this is a pretty common assertion, that historians can only investigate that which falls under the realm of naturalism. The idea of whether Jesus had risen from the dead or not falls outside of that question. And in fact, there was an author very recently who wrote a book. The book's called Zealot. The author's name is Reza Aslan. He's a Muslim scholar in the southwestern part of the United States. He argues that exact same thing. As a Muslim, he argues that if you believe Jesus has risen from the dead, you're believing in something that requires faith. It's not a good historical assertion. Well, is that really the case? We know back from the Enlightenment era that Hume argued similar matters, that any kind of miracle cannot be argued from an evidential or historical perspective. And even to today, Hume's thought keeps impacting biblical scholars. Reza Aslan is not one, but people like Bart Ehrman have argued on the record that you cannot investigate the resurrection historically. It's a miracle if it happened, and miracles are outside the realm of history. So right off the bat, before we dive into these things, it's important that we clarify our semantics, because unless we're on the same page, we're not going to be able to move forward. How we're defining history today is those set of events that happened in the past. That set of events that happened in the past, that's history. The narrow definition of history, that set of events which we can only explain naturalistically, is what a lot of historians assume before they address the question. Well, you can see the problem right off the bat. If historians assume that history has to be done naturalistically, apart from any miracles, then before you've even looked at the question, did Jesus rise from the dead, you've already answered it by saying, no, that's not a historical thing we can take a look at. Are you with me so far? The lights are pretty bright, but I can see you, and I'm going to be using you to gauge whether you're following me or not. So far, are we together on this one? So unless you employ circular reasoning and you say that Jesus' death and resurrection cannot be investigated and proven by history, we do have good reason to be able to say that if the resurrection is the best, and definitely if it's the only, explanation of the facts, then we have good reason to accept the resurrection as a historical conclusion. And that's the position that I'm going to be taking today. The last thing I'm going to look at before delving into the evidence is, what about this idea of faith and religion? What about that? Because the Protestant motto has been, it's by grace and faith alone that we are saved. Saved by faith in the grace of Jesus. So how is it possible that we can turn to evidence in order to look and see whether or not we should believe in Christianity? Shouldn't we just believe by faith? This is an inappropriate definition of faith. You need to have reasons for the faith you have so that you can share those reasons with other people. How compelling is it when someone tells you to believe in Christianity and they say, why? And you say, oh, you should just believe it, just have faith. It's not what the Bible tells us. And in fact, that was a large part of the problem I had growing up when I was a Muslim. I used to encounter Christian after Christian after Christian. When I challenged them on whether or not Christianity was true, they would just say, well, that's what I believe. I say, well, okay, so it's what you believe, but why are you asking me to then believe it if you don't have good reason? And I extrapolate that kind of question to things like the Trinity. If you really want to give a Christian a run for their money, just ask them to define the Trinity. And they'll say, well, the Trinity is the idea that God is 3 in 1. What does that mean? It's a mystery. No, the only mystery here is why you believe this. God is 3 in 1. What is he, a shampoo bottle? No, give me the explanation of what Jesus is. And so as I'm investigating Christianity, I'm running into these problems that people are not willing to give an explanation for their faith. And I'm challenging you here today, if you are a Christian, make sure you stand by that command of 1 Peter 3:15 to be ready to give a defense for the faith that you have. Now, the resurrection is pivotal for that. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 14 and 17, he says, if Jesus is not risen, our faith is in vain, and we are of all people most to be pitied. Notice he's not saying whether Jesus is risen or not, this belief helps us get through life, which is how a lot of people interpret religion, as a crutch to help you get through life, as a crutch to help you deal with death. That's not what Paul is saying. Paul is saying the exact opposite. If this did not happen, if Jesus is not risen, our faith is in vain, and we are of all people most to be pitied. We're deluded. We're following a lie if Jesus is not risen. So you take a look at what Paul's asserting, and he is saying that the resurrection is the linchpin of the Christian faith. Well, what about those in the book of Acts? What about Jesus? What do they have to say about the resurrection? In the book of Acts, when people start preaching the gospel, what you don't hear them saying is, do you know you're going to get to heaven? Do you want to be saved? Do you want to live a better life? That's not the kind of thing they're saying. You see, the very first sermon from Peter in Acts chapter 2 was explicitly about, at its culmination, the resurrection. This man, Jesus, has risen from the dead. Repent and be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. The resurrection. As you continue through the book of Acts, time after time after time, it's the resurrection that people are pointing to. And you might ask me, well, Nabil, what if it's just to a specific audience? You know, Peter was talking to the Jews in that occasion. Maybe the Jews are thinking about resurrection in a certain way, and therefore it's Peter just addressing the Jews. No, interestingly enough, the first time we see something on a scale towards philosophers and towards thinkers in the Greco-Roman world is in Acts chapter 17. And here Paul is in Athens, in the Areopagus. He's speaking to not Jews, but exactly to Greco-Romans, to Stoics. As Paul goes along, he even quotes basically Greco-Roman poetry. Menander is quoted there. You also see some things that are said which are very close to the writings of Seneca, a Stoic philosopher. So you see Paul interacting with Greco-Roman poetry and philosophy, but as he does that, the culminating message once again is Jesus' resurrection. We believe in this because this man Jesus rose from the dead. Now, how does it work? How does it work? Jesus himself was asked the question. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus was asked the question, why should we listen to you? Essentially, that's what the question was asking. People were, literally, so I can be more accurate to the source, people were saying to Jesus, Jesus, show us a sign. Show us a sign for why we should listen to the kinds of things you're saying. Jesus had just exorcised a demon-possessed boy. So they're like, show us a sign. He's like, did you not see what he just exorcised a demon? And then he responds to them and he says, an evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign. Essentially, you're ignoring this. I will not give you any sign except for the sign of Jonah. For as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so shall the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth. What is Jesus saying? He's saying, I'm going to give you one proof for the claims I am stating, and that is that as Jonah was apparently dead in the heart of a whale, I am going to be dead in the belly of the earth. Sheol is the word that's used. Sheol is the Hebrew word for the grave. But then I'm going to return. Just as Jonah returned, I am going to return. The resurrection is Jesus' statement, his proof, his epistemically provided evidence that he is actually who he claims to be. The fact of the matter is, there are a lot of religious claims where people can be just given a set of beliefs. I remember when I was talking to a Buddhist. This was my friend. I went to Old Dominion University for my undergraduate, and I had a Buddhist friend named Zach. And one day I asked Zach, and this is while I was preaching Islam to him, and I said, Zach, I've given you good reasons to accept Islam. Why should I be a Buddhist? Why should I accept the faith that you follow? Can you give me your reasons? And he said, Nabil, I don't think you're seeing Buddhism correctly. Buddhism isn't the kind of religion that provides people reasons to believe it. It's a path that you can follow, and if you choose to follow it, you can. And I said, well, thank you. I won't. Because I need a reason to change everything that I'm doing to follow what you're doing. I need it to at least be better somehow, or to be grounded in some kind of truth. And Buddhism isn't that kind of religion, or philosophy if you want to call it. Hinduism is the same thing. It's not providing you any kind of epistemic proof for its claims. And frankly, Judaism works in the same direction. Judaism works off of testimony from further back, what people have said and passed down to their children. If you remember in the book of Joshua, it's told for people to build altars of rocks so that they can pass to their children the things that God had done. But at no point are they challenging others to find evidence for their faith. This is something that's very limited to a few religious beliefs, and Christianity is one of them. Now, you would rightly be critiquing me right now if you said, Nabil, you're quoting the Bible pretty willy-nilly. I'm not a Christian. I don't believe in the inspiration of the Bible. Why should I accept these references that you are giving? Fair enough. And that was, in fact, the exact same challenge I gave when I was a Muslim. I don't believe in the Bible. I don't believe in its reliability. So why should I listen to the quotations you're providing? Let's look at the nature of the evidence, the historical evidence that we're going to use to build the case for the resurrection before continuing. The Bible is not one book. Some people approach the Bible as if it was one writing, and if it's biased, we throw it out, we can't use it. That is a very short-sighted way to see the Bible. The Bible is actually 66 books, 39 Old Testament, and then Jesus comes, and you have 27 New Testament books. Those books have different genres. They say different things in different ways. I'm not saying contradictory things, but they're saying different things in different ways. They have different voices and different genres. For example, you read the book of Ecclesiastes and Lamentations, those two books, you read that differently from how you would read, say, the book of Romans. The book of Romans is a book on theology. Ecclesiastes, parts of Psalms, Lamentations, are a book of the expression of the human heart. You read the book of the Gospels separately from the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is a book of prophecy, whereas the Gospels are Greco-Roman bioi, they're historical biographies. So they have different genres. You don't approach them the same way. To do so would be to inappropriately approach the Bible in hermeneutics. Different books are intended to be read in different ways. And so let's just say, for example, and I'm not arguing this, but let's just say that someone said, Nabil, I can't trust the book of Genesis. It says that the universe was made in 6 days, and I can't trust that kind of thing. Okay, fair enough. But that doesn't affect the reliability from a historical perspective of the 4 Gospels. You see where I'm going with this? The 4 Gospels were written later by different people in a totally different genre. So let's not inappropriately equate 2 books and impute one to the other. So first, the Bible, multiple books written by multiple authors. Well, what about that then? Are these reliable still? I haven't answered the question whether any of these are historically reliable. We need to assess the weight of these evidences for what they're worth. The New Testament, like I said, 27 books. The first 5 of those purport to be historical records. From Matthew to Mark to Luke to John, and in the book of Acts, which is actually Luke part B. The same author wrote that second So it's often called Luke Acts. Those 5 books are attempting to provide historical evidence. So like any book of history, then, we should weigh them for their historical records. How far removed are they from Jesus, whom they're reporting about? Jesus lived somewhere between, or he died somewhere between 30 and 33 AD. The Gospel of Mark, which is the first of the 4 Gospels to have been written, is at latest dated 72 AD. At latest. A lot of scholars, I as well, am very comfortable dating it around 50 AD, mid-50s, late 50s, somewhere around there. Some people move it even earlier, and they have good reason to do that, by the way. If you have any questions about this, we're going to have a Q&A time. I think there's good reasons to see portions of the Gospel of Mark coming from the 30s, so within 10 years of Jesus' death. But I'm trying to be as amenable to the skeptics as possible and say, even if it is 40 years after Jesus died, that's still within the lifetime of his companions. It's still within the lifetimes of the community of people living around Jesus. And so if the early Christian community is passing this stuff around, they are there to correct any kind of historical inaccuracies. They're still alive. Matthew and Luke come within the next few decades. John is written somewhere between 90 to 95 AD. Again, at the latest. Some of the greatest biblical scholars alive today, such as Daniel Wallace, who's at Dallas Theological Seminary, he would put the Gospel of John no later than the mid-60s. So some people even put it that early, but at the latest, people put it at 90 to 95 AD. That's within 60 years of Jesus' life. And we know people like Polycarp, like John, lived into their 90s and 100s, so there are people still alive from Jesus' time, even when John's Gospel is being written. That's the nature of the biblical authorship here, of the Gospels, what we're taking a look at. Now, to juxtapose this, to compare this with other books, let's take a figure from ancient history who's very well known, Alexander the Great. The first major biography written about Alexander the Great came 400 years after he died. So you compare something like 40 years to 400 years, there's no comparison. Now, I'm giving you 40 years for the Gospel of Mark, but the fact of the matter is the Gospels aren't the only things we can use for the historical evidence here, and we are going to use more. There was somebody who wrote even before the Gospel of Mark was written. His name's Paul. Paul wrote letters which obviously were written before he died. Kind of hard to write them posthumously, unless he too had risen from the dead, but that's not the investigation tonight. Paul's letters, therefore, are written earlier than 65 AD. Some of his writings, though, contain doctrines and codified proclamations from the early church that he was quoting. So, for example, if I quote something in a letter, let's say I quote the preamble, or if I quote the Bill of Rights, whatever, I quote something from the late 18th century in my writing, that's still from before. Even though my writing is from the 21st century, I'm quoting something from earlier than that. Paul does the exact same thing in some of his writings. One of these is a very well-known creed from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8. Let me give you the context here. A group of scholars who are not Christian, or at least not Orthodox Christian, they're called the Jesus Seminar. Many of these people are atheists and agnostic, and they attempt to revisit what the New Testament says and how accurate it actually is. So these are people who publish some of the most anti-Christian literature that's out there. They were investigating the New Testament to grade whether certain verses are historically reliable and whether certain verses are not. When they came to 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8, they concluded that these verses are so early that they come from within a decade of Jesus' death. Like I said, these are not Christian scholars, or at least not what we think of when we think of Christian scholars. They're saying within a decade or so of Jesus' death. Now, some scholars who are very highly respected, such as James D.G. Dunn, he's a retired professor from Durham University in the UK. He goes much further. He says that 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8, is in fact so early that we can be virtually certain that it was codified within months of Jesus' death. Can we compare 400 years on Alexander the Great to months after Jesus' death. That's about as fast as anything can possibly be from historical times. And if you want me to read for you what 1 Corinthians 15 says in these verses, I will do so. It says this, Paul says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." Scholars have concluded, James D.G. Dunn, one of them, that this comes from within months after Jesus' death. What is it saying? It is saying that Jesus died and rose from the dead. Now, that doesn't mean this is automatically true, just because it comes from within months after Jesus' death. That doesn't mean it's automatically true. But what it does mean is the community is preaching Jesus' death and resurrection that soon after he was crucified. And the people who were around at the time of his ministry, the people who claim to have seen him, are still there, which is why Paul says he appeared to the 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive. Why does he put that qualifier in there, most of whom are still alive? Well, he's telling them, look, if you want to see people who have seen the risen Jesus, go verify what I'm saying. Let their testimony be proof for you that this happened. So, what is the nature of the evidence we're looking at tonight? I still haven't gotten to the point where we build a case yet. We're just taking a look at the nature of the evidence. Do we throw out the Bible beforehand? No. We see it as historical documents, or at least those parts that purport to be historical. Then we weigh them for how reliable they are. We try to sift past their biases, just like we would for any historical document. And we also have portions that are so early that they're within months, theoretically, after Jesus died, or perhaps a decade or so, but still a newsflash according to ancient standards. That's the strength of the historical testimony for what we're going to be looking at tonight. So now that we've seen kind of the weight of the historical records, and we've taken a look at whether or not we can actually investigate the question, let's take a look at the actual argument. The argument that I'm going to provide for you comes from two scholars, very highly acclaimed scholars within certain circles. One is a distinguished professor at Liberty University. The other is a professor at Houston Baptist University. Their names are Gary Habermas and Michael Licona. Gary Habermas is an amazing man. He himself went through an extended period of doubt regarding the resurrection, and he made it his doctoral research to investigate the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection in the mid-70s. Since then, he has read every single scholarly article on the resurrection and on the death of Jesus, printed in English, French, and German. He's got a lot of time on his hands, apparently. So he goes through every one in all those three languages, and he catalogs what all these scholars believe. Over 3,500 articles he's read, cataloging what scholars believe. Now, which scholars is he referring to? Atheist, agnostic, skeptical, Hindu, Jewish, Christian, across the theological spectrum. He takes what all of them write and he catalogs what they conclude. What he has found is that certain facts about Jesus' death and resurrection, or at least the time surrounding his death and resurrection, are so commonly adhered to, not just by Christians, but by non-Christian scholars, that they're virtually unanimous amongst those who are studying the historical Jesus. Once again, there are certain things that pretty much everyone who studies Jesus agrees about Jesus. One of those facts is that Jesus died by crucifixion. About Jesus' death by crucifixion, you have scholars across the board, once again, who agree that it happened. People like Paula Fredrickson, who's an agnostic or an atheist. You have people like Marcus Borg, Bart Ehrman, who's himself agnostic, saying things like this, that Jesus died by crucifixion is as sure as any historical fact can be. If there's anything we can know about the historical Jesus life, it's that he died by crucifixion. So the scholars across the board are saying fact number one, Jesus died by crucifixion. Fact number two that Gary Habermas points out is that the disciples of Jesus truly believed he had risen from the dead. The disciples truly believed Jesus had risen from the dead. Again, that doesn't mean he had risen from the dead, but they actually believed it. They weren't lying about it. And fact number 3, that not just the disciples of Jesus believed that he had risen from the dead, but enemies of Jesus, specifically Paul, who was Saul of Tarsus, who was arresting Christians at the time, and also those who didn't follow Jesus, such as James, his brother. We know from the Gospels that James was not a follower of Jesus during his lifetime, and yet all of a sudden he becomes a follower of Jesus to when he's willing to die for the fact that Jesus had risen and appeared.
In his book, Recapture the Wonder, Ravi Zacharias tells us our sense of wonder is a blessing from God, given so that we would continually be amazed at his beauty and creation. But for many of us, our wonder has diminished through the years, and we doubt that we'll ever be able to experience the overwhelming sense of awe we once had as children. In Recapture the Wonder, Ravi helps you find the extraordinary in the ordinary. Order your copy by calling 1-800-705-7729.
The mission of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries is really to reach the thinker and the skeptic, to answer the questions, and do evangelism undergirded by apologetics, in clearing all of the obstacles that stand in the way so that the questioner can take a direct look at the cross of Jesus Christ. We put it simply, it is to help the thinker to believe and the believer to think. The fivefold thrust of RZIM has always been first and foremost evangelism. We do evangelism undergirded by apologetics. We are involved in training people where they are and within the church, and training our young to be able to answer the questions that are being asked of them, and then spiritual disciplines, because we never want to forget the heart that has to be touched and reached. So we've got evangelism, apologetics, training, and spiritual disciplines. But there is a fifth very important component. Wellspring International is the humanitarian arm of RZIM, which is apologetics with a touch. These 5 components of evangelism, apologetics, training, spiritual disciplines, and the humanitarian need. These are the issues that really carry us into various settings.
You've been watching The Apologists, a television ministry of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. We're grateful for your prayers and financial support. If you'd like to know more about this ministry or would like to donate to our efforts, you can call us at 1-800-448-6766 or visit us online